So if you're watching 2025 unfold and seeing this total collision course, where personal privacy, free speech, the future of AI governance are all hitting at once, well, you're absolutely right. This really is shaping up to be the year of volatility in tech policy. We're seeing policy pivots, escalating enforcement, and just this intense global scramble to figure out generative AI.
That's exactly the core challenge we're tackling today. We've been digging into sources, documenting these, well, pretty dramatic shifts. And our mission here is really to distill the critical intelligence you need. We want you to understand not just like the long list of new rules, but the strategic implications. What does this mean for actually doing compliance globally?
Right. Specifically, we're going to unpack the incredible regulatory whiplash around AI right here in the U.S. And then we'll pivot to the high-stakes world of global content regulation, thinking about the EU's massive financial threats. And finally, we'll look at the practical, proactive steps businesses in the Asia-Pacific region are taking to, well, survive this really fragmented world.
Let's start at home, though, because the U.S. federal stance on AI governance, it's created just monumental uncertainty.
Uncertainty feels like an understatement. We saw this dramatic, almost instantaneous reversal. President Biden's 2023 executive order, remember, that was heavily focused on binding rules for fairness, transparency, privacy protections. It was just rescinded by the subsequent administration in 2025. Gone.
And that reversal completely shifted the federal direction. It went from, to trying to strictly control the tech to emphasizing deregulation, promoting American leadership in AI. And crucially, this means that initial push for mandatory rules, it's kind of devolved into this draft AI action plan, which emphasizes voluntary industry standards and innovation incentives. That strategic risk, that shift from mandate to suggestion, that's really the first thing companies need to wrap their heads around.
Okay, but while the federal government is maybe focusing more on innovation now, state-level enforcement, they're not waiting around, are they? In fact, we're seeing states use some really creative incentives to actually drive compliance. Tell us about Tennessee's unique approach, this carrot you mentioned.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Tennessee is offering an affirmative defense against enforcement actions, which is, well, it's a pretty revolutionary regulatory model, right? Trading the usual punitive stick for more of a collaborative carrot. Basically, a business can use this defense if they simply maintain a written privacy program that reasonably conforms with the NIST privacy framework or, a comparable standard.
So the state is essentially saying, look, adopt a recognized comprehensive standard like NIST, document it, and we'll give you a shield against regulatory action.
Yeah.
That really forces businesses to think about compliance for operational benefit, not just out of fear.
Precisely. But the stick is still very much out there, especially in California. We saw the CCPA's enforcement arm, the CPPA, fine a smaller retailer, Todd Snyder, Inc., over $345,000. Now, that was for things like infrastructure failures, excessive data collection, but it proves no company is too small to face serious financial penalties.
Right, and $345,000 for a smaller retailer. That hurts. And if dealing with infrastructure failures wasn't complex enough, the enforcement criteria seemed to be getting really subjective.
Yeah.
Look at that Healthline case. They weren't fined for some obvious data breach, right? Their violation was about the purpose limitation rule.
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, tricky for businesses. Healthline was sharing article titles that suggested medical conditions for ad targeting. And the enforcement argument was that this went beyond a consumer's reasonable expectation, even if it was technically disclosed somewhere deep in a privacy policy.
Okay, hold on. If they disclosed it, how is that a violation? Isn't that an impossible standard? How can any business possibly define what a reasonable consumer's subjective expectation is in advance? Especially for something seemingly minor like an article title. That sounds like a compliance nightmare.
It is, definitely. Because it forces companies to probe the intention behind using seemingly innocuous data. Compliance now isn't just about disclosure, it's about anticipating the consumer's subjective perception of that value exchange. Are they getting fair value for what they're giving up? And navigating all these requirements, from maybe adopting NIST standards proactively to trying to guess these subjective CCPA risks, it absolutely requires centralized resources. You need robust governance. So if you are grappling with building out that governance and policy implementation across this fragmented landscape right now, we really recommend turning to www.compliancehub.wiki. They focus specifically on these kinds of challenges.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's pivot now, dramatically, from that U.S. carrot and stick model to the EU's, global sledgehammer, the Digital Services Act, or DSA. This regulation carries just an immense financial threat, and it's forcing platforms to drastically change how they operate worldwide.
The stakes are enormous, no question. The DSA specifically targets very large online platforms, VLOPs. It forces them to mitigate systemic risks, and that category is broad. It includes controlling misleading or deceptive content, disinformation,
Right.
and the penalty for failure. Fines up to 6% of a company's global revenue.
6%. Global. Wow. That's an existential threat for sure.
Absolutely.
And the practical effect then of trying to avoid that threat is that platforms are almost forced to err heavily on the side of censorship, right? Which immediately throws this huge friction between the DSA's stated intent and its actual impact on free speech into sharp relief. Sources we looked at reveal some specific, pretty contentious scenarios from a commission workshop back in May 2025.
That's right. We saw examples discussed where common political phrases, things like "we need to take back our country," were
Yeah.
being categorized as coded language and potentially treated as illegal hate speech.
Yeah.
This is crucial. The regulation isn't just targeting clearly illegal activity, it seems to be bleeding into targeting political dissent, even humor and satire.
Yeah, I saw other examples too, like Polish regulators apparently asked TikTok to remove posts that were questioning the effectiveness of electric vehicles. When core policy debate, actual discussion about EVs starts getting categorized this way simply to avoid massive fines, well, the chilling effect on public discourse is pretty obvious.
hmm And meanwhile, while Europe is cracking down like this, Meta is taking the exact opposite strategic tack over here. They announced in 2025 they'd actually loosen their content rules. They're getting rid of third-party fact checkers in favor of an X-style, crowdsourced community notes system.
That is a fascinating reversal. Why would they abandon a system that seemed to work? Didn't Meta's own data from like 2018 show fact-checking was effective? I remember seeing that when fact-checkers rated an article as false, it reduces future views by over 80%.
It certainly looks like a strategic business decision, likely aimed at political appeasement. By reducing their own internal moderation footprint, Meta maybe hopes to avoid the political heat that comes with making those tough content decisions. Even if, as you said, it means removing one of the tools shown to be pretty effective at reducing the spread of verifiably false articles.
Right. And as content moderation potentially gets outsourced or loosened, the threat from AI-generated harm, financial harm, social harm, it just skyrockets, doesn't it? We're right in the middle of this deepfake dilemma.
Yeah, and the scale and the believability are just unprecedented now. Think about that MedBeds deception. An AI-generated video looked exactly like a Fox News segment, even had synthetic versions of Lara and Donald Trump promoting this completely debunked conspiracy theory. It uses these hyper-realistic deepfakes to amplify and sort of validate existing fringe beliefs. It really erodes trust.
But the financial implications are immediate and terrifying too. They threaten market integrity itself. We only have to look back to May 2023. Remember those AI-manipulated images? Falsely depicted an explosion near the Pentagon. They caused the Dow Jones Industrial Average to drop 85 points in literally 4 minutes.
Exactly. The risk isn't theoretical anymore. It's an active, demonstrable threat to global markets.
Okay, so shifting gears again, moving across the globe. The Asia-Pacific region seems to be navigating this complexity with maybe a far more collaborative and harmonized approach.
It's definitely a clear contrast. You see policymakers in places like Singapore, South Korea, others, they're really emphasizing the need for alignment and interoperability. They're actively trying to counter the kind of policy fragmentation we're seeing between, say, the US and the EU. The focus is much more on building internal structures that can work together.
That internal focus seems key.
It is. All 5 major APAC jurisdictions we looked at, Australia, China, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, they all recognize that developing internal AI governance and robust risk management frameworks is just critical good practice. Singapore's proposed model AI governance framework is probably the leading example of how to tackle these issues proactively, building that internal capability.
And they're not just talking about it, they're actually using regulatory tools like sandboxes quite actively. I saw figures like early 2025, there were 66 sandboxes worldwide, and 31 of those were specifically focused on testing AI innovation and governance frameworks in a safe, controlled environment.
Right. And Singapore, through its IMDA and the AI Verify Foundation, has the Generative AI Evaluation Sandbox. That one's specifically tailored to defining benchmarks for large language models, or LLMs. This kind of rapid, proactive testing is just essential given how fast the underlying technology keeps evolving.
Okay, so this brings us to the really actionable imperatives, right, for the developers and the deployers of generative AI, especially around security by design. These aren't just abstract concepts anymore. They're practical steps you need to take to survive this global regulatory environment.
Exactly right. And it really starts with data governance. That means prioritizing how you mitigate model bias, constantly evaluating your training data, filtering the outputs. Developers absolutely must adopt a privacy by design approach, build the safeguards in from the very beginning. This could even include considering the use of synthetic data sometimes to minimize using real personal information in training sets.
And then you have to implement strong safety measures, right? Especially for complex AI systems that interact with the public. The sources really highlight the necessity of red teaming. That's having authorized security teams actively try to break your systems, find the weaknesses. Plus, continuous monitoring, obviously, to detect new vulnerabilities as they emerge.
There's also that critical push for content provenance measures, things like digital labeling or watermarking, trying to identify AI-generated output. The goal is transparency about where content came from, even while acknowledging the tech, especially for text watermarking, is still pretty early in its development.
So given this increasing reliance on third-party models, the whole supply chain security piece securing the chips, the software, the model weights themselves becomes paramount. And if you, listening, are the one managing these complex security risks, everything from setting up red teaming exercises to ensuring really strong vendor vetting, you need trusted partners who specialize in this rapidly evolving landscape. We recommend visiting www.cintilmarketplace.com. They can help you find the right security solutions and trusted vendors to really safeguard your AI systems.
So looking back across the US, Europe, and APAC, the landscape, it really tells a clear story. It's a story of convergence towards standardized governance, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The trends seem to be integrating AI risk directly into data privacy regulation. And that's forcing companies to adopt comprehensive standardized governance, whether they do it voluntarily like through frameworks like NIST or APAC best practices, or whether they're forced to by the threat of severe financial penalties like we saw with the CCPA and definitely with the DSA.
Which means, fundamentally, effective AI governance isn't just a legal or compliance issue anymore. It's really an engineering imperative. It hinges on building robust internal risk management, ensuring transparency, and proactively addressing things like bias and data security right from the very first stages of development.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's the question that should occupy your thoughts going forward. The most challenging issue facing the future of global discourse. It might not be whether AI can create misinformation, we know it can, but rather, can governments effectively distinguish between content regulation aimed at stopping crime or truly harmful material, and regulation that ends up chilling protected political speech, especially when, as we saw, things like dissent, humor, even just policy debate are being explicitly targeted by regulators, perhaps driven by the fear of those catastrophic financial penalties. Something to think about.